You think you know what cruelty looked like in ancient Rome. You've seen the movies, the gladiator fights, the dramatic executions in the Colosseum. But what if I told you that everything you learned about Roman brutality was just the sanitized version? What if the real horror wasn't happening in the arena for cheering crowds, but behind palace walls where emperors turned human suffering into their personal entertainment? Tonight, we're diving into the darkest corners of the Roman Empire, where absolute power didn't just corrupt absolutely, it created monsters who viewed human beings as disposable playthings. We're talking about documented historical accounts that will make your blood run cold. Stories so disturbing that most history textbooks skip right over them because, frankly, they're too horrific to teach in schools. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what I'm about to share with you will completely reshape how you see the Roman Empire forever. Picture this scene from the imperial palace in Rome. Around 40 CE, Emperor Caligula has just finished his evening meal, and he's bored. Not the kind of bored where you scroll through your phone or watch Netflix. The kind of bored that comes with unlimited power and a complete absence of empathy. So he snaps his fingers and calls for entertainment. What happens next isn't a performance or a game. It's a human being's worst nightmare made real for one man's amusement. The truth about Roman slavery isn't just about hard labor in mines or fields. That's the story they're comfortable telling you. The real story is about emperors who treated human beings like living toys, who invented new forms of cruelty the way we invent new apps, who turned torture into an art form and called it imperial privilege. We're talking about a system where your life could end on a whim, where your pain was someone else's pleasure, where the most powerful men in the world competed to see who could devise the most creative ways to break the human spirit. And the most chilling part? They kept detailed records of it all, as if documenting their own descent into madness was just another administrative duty. Let's start with the emperor who made his own horse a consul but treated his slaves worse than animals. Caligula wasn't just eccentric or mentally unstable. He was a calculated sadist who understood exactly how much suffering he could inflict before his victims died, and he calibrated his cruelty accordingly. His morning routine didn't involve checking emails or reading reports. It involved selecting which slaves would provide his entertainment for the day. Not entertainment in any normal sense, but psychological and physical torture so elaborate that it required planning, props, and sometimes an audience of terrified courtiers who had to smile and applaud or risk becoming the next victims. One documented account describes how Caligula would force slaves to watch their family members tortured before their eyes, not as punishment for any crime, but simply because he enjoyed the psychological destruction. Mothers forced to watch their children suffer. Husbands made to witness their wives brutalized. Children compelled to see their parents broken. The emperor would study their faces, fascinated by the progression from hope to despair to complete mental collapse. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Caligula didn't just want to break people quickly. He wanted to break them slowly, methodically, scientifically. He developed what his court historians euphemistically called graduated suffering, a systematic approach to torture that could be sustained for days, weeks, even months without killing the victim. The process began with isolation. Slaves selected for Caligula's attention would be separated from everyone they knew, locked in chambers beneath the palace where their screams couldn't disturb the emperor's dinner parties above. Then came the psychological warfare. They'd be told their families were dead, shown fake evidence of their loved ones' deaths, convinced that their suffering was meaningless because everyone they cared about was already gone. Only then would the physical torture begin. And this is where Caligula's creativity became truly monstrous. He didn't rely on simple beatings or whippings. Those were for amateurs. He commissioned specially designed devices, tools that could inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and aware. Iron shoes that were heated until they glowed, then forced onto feet. Masks with spikes on the inside that would pierce the face with every movement. Restraints that would slowly tighten over hours, crushing bones with agonizing slowness. One court physician, writing decades later when he was safely out of Rome, described being forced to monitor victims during these sessions. His job wasn't to provide mercy or relief. It was to ensure they stayed alive long enough to satisfy the emperor's curiosity about human endurance. He wrote that Caligula would take notes, treating torture sessions like scientific experiments, recording how long different types of people could withstand specific forms of pain. Women lasted longer under certain tortures than men. Children broke faster psychologically, but sometimes endured physical pain with surprising resilience. Elderly slaves often died too quickly to provide adequate entertainment. These weren't observations born from sadistic curiosity alone. They were data points in Caligula's systematic study of human suffering. The emperor kept detailed journals of his experiments, complete with sketches of devices and methods. These weren't the ravings of a madman. They were the meticulous records of someone who had turned cruelty into a science. Archaeological evidence from palace excavations has uncovered rooms that match these descriptions. Chambers with drainage systems for blood, walls with iron rings for restraints, and ventilation systems designed to carry screams away from the main palace. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Caligula's reign of terror was how normalized it became. Courtiers grew accustomed to the screams echoing from beneath their feet during formal dinners. Servants learned to clean blood from marble floors without showing any emotion. Guards developed techniques for disposing of bodies so efficiently that the palace never smelled of death, despite death being a daily occurrence. The emperor's cruelty wasn't random or impulsive. It was scheduled, organized, institutionalized. He had specific days of the week dedicated to different types of torture. Mondays for psychological experiments, Wednesdays for testing new devices, Fridays for what he called artistic torture. Elaborate scenes designed to be visually striking as well as agonizing. And here's what makes this even more horrifying. Other members of the imperial family were expected to attend these sessions as if they were watching a play or listening to music. Caligula's sisters, his wife, visiting dignitaries, all were required to observe and applaud his creativity. Showing disgust or horror was interpreted as criticism of the emperor, which could easily make you the next victim. One account describes a visiting senator who made the mistake of looking away during a particularly brutal session. Caligula noticed immediately and decided to demonstrate his displeasure by having the senator's own slave tortured using the exact same methods, forcing the senator to watch while explaining that this was what happened to people who didn't appreciate imperial artistry. The psychological impact on witnesses was part of the design. Caligula understood that fear was most effective when it was personal, when people could imagine themselves or their loved ones in the victim's place. So he made sure everyone understood that the only thing separating them from the torture chamber was his momentary goodwill. But Caligula was just getting started. His innovations in human cruelty would be refined and expanded by the emperors who followed him. Because once you establish that human beings are disposable entertainment, once you normalize torture as imperial privilege, once you create institutions dedicated to suffering, those systems take on a life of their own. What came after Caligula wasn't a return to sanity. It was an escalation, a competition among emperors to see who could push the boundaries of cruelty even further. And the slaves of Rome, already the most powerless people in the empire, became the testing ground for new depths of human depravity. The palace torture chambers that Caligula established didn't disappear when he was assassinated. They were expanded, refined, and passed down like any other imperial institution. The devices were improved. The methods were systematized. The record-keeping became even more detailed. What had started as one madman's hobby became the foundation for an entire culture of institutionalized sadism. And we're just getting started, because if you think Caligula's systematic torture was the worst Rome had to offer, wait until you hear about the emperors who turned mass murder into public spectacle, who created new forms of execution specifically designed to maximize suffering, who treated human life as nothing more than raw material for their twisted entertainment. The Roman Empire's relationship with human suffering wasn't an accident or a byproduct of their conquests. It was deliberate, calculated, and continuously refined over centuries. They didn't just accept cruelty, they perfected it. They didn't just tolerate suffering, they celebrated it. They didn't just use slaves, they consumed them. Emperor Nero took everything Caligula had established and turned it into performance art. Where Caligula had been content with private torture sessions, Nero wanted audiences. Where Caligula had treated cruelty as personal entertainment, Nero made it public policy. Where Caligula had broken individuals, Nero set out to break entire populations. But Nero's innovations in human suffering weren't just about scale. They were about creativity, about finding new ways to destroy people that no one had ever imagined before. He didn't just want to kill slaves or torture them. He wanted to transform them into something else entirely, to break down the very concept of human dignity and rebuild it as imperial spectacle. The methods he developed, the institutions he created, the precedents he established, they would echo through Roman history for centuries, creating a template for systematic dehumanization that other empires would study and emulate. Because once you prove that humans can be treated as entertainment, once you demonstrate that suffering can be art, once you show that power can be absolute, there's no going back. The slaves of Rome weren't just victims of individual cruelty. They were casualties in a war against human dignity itself. A systematic campaign to prove that some people weren't really people at all, that their pain didn't matter, that their lives had no value beyond what they could provide to their masters. And the most disturbing part of all? This wasn't ancient history to the Romans. This was Tuesday. This was normal. This was just how the world worked when you had absolute power and no one to stop you from using it. The gladiatorial games. Everyone knows about them, right? The epic battles in the Colosseum, the thumbs up or thumbs down, the glory of dying well in the arena. But what you learned in history class was the sanitized Hollywood version. The real gladiatorial system wasn't about honor or combat prowess. It was about psychological warfare against an entire class of human beings, designed to break spirits before it ever broke bodies. Let me tell you about the gladiator schools, because these weren't training academies. They were laboratories for human experimentation. The ludi, as they were called, operated under a simple principle. Take broken people and break them further until they become something that's no longer quite human. Then unleash them on each other while crowds cheered. Most gladiators weren't volunteers seeking glory. They were slaves, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and people who had fallen so far into debt that they'd literally sold themselves into this nightmare. Once you entered a gladiator school, you ceased to exist as a person. You became inventory, property with a specific market value based on how entertainingly you could suffer and die. The training process was designed to strip away every human instinct except violence. New arrivals were chained in underground cells barely large enough to lie down. No light, no human contact, fed just enough to stay alive. This wasn't punishment for bad behavior. This was standard procedure, designed to break down psychological resistance before training even began. After weeks of isolation, they'd be dragged into the training yard, blinking in the sunlight like animals emerging from caves. The instructors weren't teachers. They were sculptors working with human clay, and their job was to carve away everything that made these people human until only killing machines remained. They were given new names, erasing their identities. Spartacus wasn't born Spartacus. That was his slave name, his gladiator brand. Their families were declared dead to them. Their past lives were forbidden topics. Speaking about their former existence earned brutal punishment. The message was clear. You are nothing but what we make you. The training itself was systematically sadistic. Gladiators were forced to practice on each other, learning to inflict maximum damage while keeping their opponents alive long enough to provide entertainment. They'd spend hours perfecting techniques for non-fatal wounds that would spray blood dramatically, for cuts that looked devastating but wouldn't kill immediately, for ways to prolong suffering while putting on a good show. They were taught to read crowd reactions, to understand when spectators wanted mercy and when they wanted blood. A gladiator who killed too quickly was punished. One who showed too much mercy faced the whip. They had to learn to calibrate death itself, to become connoisseurs of their own and others' suffering. The psychological conditioning was perhaps worse than the physical training. Gladiators were forced to watch executions of those who tried to escape or resist, but these weren't quick deaths. They were elaborate tortures designed to demonstrate what happened to anyone who forgot their place. Crucifixion was considered merciful compared to some of the methods used on escaped gladiators. They were made to participate in these executions, to understand that they were all complicit in a system that consumed human beings like fuel. New gladiators would be forced to hammer nails into the hands of former friends who'd attempted escape. The message was unmistakable. There is no brotherhood here, no loyalty except to the system that owns you. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. The Romans discovered that broken people fight harder than whole people. A gladiator who had completely surrendered his humanity, who had accepted that he was nothing more than entertainment, fought with a desperate fury that intact humans couldn't match. So they perfected techniques for creating this psychological state. They would force gladiators to kill people they cared about. New arrivals who formed friendships would be pitted against each other in training matches that only one could survive. Gladiators who showed attachment to family members still living would watch those family members tortured unless they proved their loyalty by inflicting pain on fellow slaves. The Roman poet Martial wrote admiringly about gladiators who showed no emotion while killing, who treated human death as casually as butchers treated animal slaughter. He didn't understand that this wasn't natural courage. It was the result of systematic psychological destruction that had removed every human response except violence. The different classes of gladiators tell their own horrific story. Bestiari were forced to fight wild animals with minimal protection, but they weren't meant to win. They were human prey, dressed up as hunters to make the slaughter more entertaining. The crowd loved watching desperate humans try to survive against lions and bears, loved seeing the moment when hope turned to terror. Noxi were condemned criminals forced to fight without armor or training. They were walking dead men, given weapons just sharp enough to put on a show before inevitable death. But even their deaths were choreographed. They were trained to die dramatically, to scream effectively, to provide maximum entertainment value with their final moments. Retiari fought with nets and tridents, deliberately given equipment that required them to run and dodge rather than stand and fight. The crowd enjoyed the spectacle of human beings reduced to scurrying prey, desperate and undignified in their attempts to survive. Their training focused not on winning, but on providing amusing chase scenes before their inevitable defeat. The mock naval battles, the Naumachii, represent perhaps the pinnacle of Roman cruelty disguised as entertainment. Entire artificial lakes would be flooded in arenas filled with slaves forced to reenact historical naval battles. But these weren't simulations. The weapons were real, the drowning was real, the death was real. Thousands of slaves would be chained to ships that were then set on fire or deliberately sunk. The survivors would be forced to swim to platforms where they'd fight to the death for the privilege of staying alive another few minutes. The crowd would cheer as burning men leaped from ships, as wounded slaves drowned in artificial seas, as the water turned red with blood. These spectacles could last for days, with fresh slaves continuously fed into the carnage to maintain the entertainment value. The logistics alone required an industrial-scale system of human trafficking and murder. Ships had to be built specifically to sink dramatically. Slaves had to be trained to die entertainingly while drowning. Even mass murder had to be choreographed for maximum crowd appeal. But the gladiatorial system wasn't just about the games themselves. It was about creating a society-wide acceptance of the idea that some human beings existed purely for the entertainment of others. Children grew up watching humans torn apart by animals and thinking this was normal. Citizens learned to evaluate human worth based on how entertainingly someone could suffer. The social conditioning was so complete that gladiators who survived long enough to earn freedom often chose to return to the arena. Not because they loved fighting, but because the world outside offered no place for people who had been systematically stripped of their humanity. They had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt as killing machines that they could no longer function as normal human beings. Gladiator schools became proving grounds for new forms of torture and execution. Innovations developed for training would be adopted for punishment of regular slaves throughout the empire. Techniques for prolonging suffering, methods for maximizing psychological impact, tools for breaking human resistance. All were refined in the Ludi and then exported across Roman territories. The economic system built around gladiatorial combat required a constant supply of human beings to consume. This created powerful incentives for wars of conquest, for harsh criminal penalties, for debt slavery systems that trapped ordinary citizens. The arena's appetite for human flesh shaped imperial policy, drove military campaigns, and warped the entire legal system around the need to feed entertainment to the masses. Provincial governors knew they could curry favor with Rome by sending gladiators rather than taxes. Military commanders understood that live captives were worth more than dead enemies because they could be sold to gladiator schools. Judges handed out death sentences not based on justice, but on the entertainment value of different execution methods. The most successful gladiators, the ones who survived long enough to become celebrities, were perhaps the most psychologically damaged of all. They had learned to find identity in their ability to kill, to derive self-worth from crowd approval, to measure their humanity by how entertainingly they could end other people's lives. These survivors often became trainers themselves, passing on not just combat techniques, but the psychological conditioning that had destroyed their own humanity. They became complicit in perpetuating a system that had consumed them, unable to imagine any other way of existing. When gladiatorial games were finally banned in the 5th century, it wasn't because Romans suddenly developed compassion. It was because the empire could no longer afford to waste so many human beings on entertainment when they were needed for labor and military service. Economic necessity, not moral awakening, ended the systematic murder. But the gladiatorial system had already achieved its purpose. It had normalized the complete dehumanization of entire classes of people. It had created social acceptance for the idea that human suffering could be entertainment. It had established precedents for systematic cruelty that would echo through history long after the last gladiator died in the arena. The crowds who cheered in the Colosseum weren't just watching people die. They were participating in a collective ritual of dehumanization, learning to see certain types of humans as nothing more than animated entertainment. And once a society learns that lesson, once it accepts that some people aren't really people, there's no limit to the cruelty it can inflict with a clear conscience. The gladiatorial games weren't an aberration in Roman civilization. They were its logical conclusion. When you build a society on the principle that might makes right, when you create institutions based on the absolute power of masters over slaves, when you normalize violence as entertainment, you inevitably arrive at the arena. And the slaves who died there weren't just victims of individual cruelty or random violence. They were casualties in a war against human dignity itself, sacrificed on the altar of imperial entertainment, consumed by a system that had learned to feed on human suffering and call it civilization. But if you thought the public spectacles were horrific, they pale in comparison to what happened behind closed doors in Roman villas and palaces. Because while the arena gave Romans their blood and circuses, it was in the private chambers of the wealthy that true creativity in human suffering reached its most refined and personal forms. The domestic slavery system wasn't just about having servants clean your house or cook your meals. It was about owning human beings so completely that their pain became your entertainment, their humiliation your pleasure, their broken spirits your daily affirmation of absolute power. And unlike the gladiatorial games, which at least had the pretense of sport, domestic torture was pure sadism with no audience except the torturer. Let me introduce you to a practice that Roman law not only permitted, but actively protected: the absolute right of masters to do anything they wanted to their slaves. Anything. The legal term was dominica potestas, and it meant exactly what it sounds like: complete dominion over another human being's existence, including the right to torture, maim, and kill without any legal consequences whatsoever. Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, and part of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, turned slave torture into a refined art form. His villa outside Rome contained what he called his correction chambers, rooms specifically designed for the prolonged torture of household slaves. But these weren't punishments for crimes or disobedience. They were recreational activities for a man who had grown bored with conventional entertainment. Crassus would invite friends over for dinner parties that featured live torture as the evening's entertainment. Slaves would be brought in during different courses, subjected to various forms of abuse, while guests ate and discussed politics. One account describes how he would have slaves' fingers broken one by one during the appetizer course, their teeth pulled during the main course, and their eyes burned with hot irons during dessert. The dinner guests weren't horrified. They were impressed by Crassus's creativity and would offer suggestions for new tortures. It became a social competition among Rome's elite to see who could devise the most elaborate forms of human suffering. Torture techniques were traded like recipes, with wealthy Romans constantly trying to outdo each other in cruelty. But Crassus's true innovation was what he called living sculptures. He would have slaves tortured into specific positions and then use a mixture of resins and chemicals to preserve them while still alive, creating human statues that could survive for weeks in agonizing poses. These living sculptures would be placed around his villa as decorations, their muffled screams providing ambient sound for his daily activities. One sculpture involved a slave girl bent backward until her spine nearly snapped, then held in that position with metal braces while her skin was treated with preservatives. She remained conscious and aware for 18 days before finally dying. Crassus was so pleased with the result that he commissioned 12 more similar pieces, turning his garden into a gallery of human suffering. The preservation process itself was a form of torture. Slaves would be injected with chemicals that prevented death while maintaining consciousness, then positioned and braced in poses that caused constant agony. Some were arranged as if dancing, their legs twisted at impossible angles. Others were posed as if praying, their arms extended upward until the shoulders dislocated and the muscles tore. These weren't isolated incidents of madness. They were social events. Crassus would host viewing parties where other wealthy Romans would tour his collection of living sculptures, admiring the craftsmanship and discussing the techniques involved. The conversations would focus on artistic merit rather than human suffering, as if the screaming decorations were marble statues rather than dying people. The economic aspect of domestic torture reveals another layer of systematic cruelty. Wealthy Romans would purchase slaves specifically for torture, creating a market demand that drove specialized slave trading. Certain physical characteristics commanded higher prices. Slaves with particularly sensitive skin, those with musical voices that would scream melodically, children whose terror responses were considered more entertaining than adults. Slave dealers would advertise their merchandise based on torture potential. Sales documents that survive in Roman archives describe slaves in terms that read like modern product specifications. Young Gallic female, excellent pain tolerance, vocal responses, exceptional, recommended for extended sessions. These weren't euphemisms. They were literal descriptions of human beings being sold as torture implements. The training of household slaves included conditioning them to accept torture as normal. New slaves would be subjected to increasingly severe abuse until they stopped showing emotional responses. The goal wasn't to break them completely, which would make them useless, but to calibrate their fear and despair to provide maximum entertainment value. They would be taught to scream at specific volumes, to beg in ways that please their masters, to maintain consciousness during procedures that would normally cause people to faint from pain. Slaves who learned these skills quickly were considered more valuable and might avoid the worst tortures. Those who resisted training faced escalating brutality until they complied or died. Roman medical knowledge was actually quite advanced, and this knowledge was perverted into techniques for prolonging torture. Physicians were employed by wealthy households not to heal slaves, but to keep them alive during extended torture sessions. They developed methods for preventing death from blood loss, for maintaining consciousness during severe pain, for ensuring that torture victims could survive repeated sessions. These medical professionals wrote treatises on torture techniques that read like modern surgical manuals. They cataloged which types of injuries would heal quickly enough to allow repeated torture, which pain receptors could be stimulated for maximum effect, which drugs could enhance suffering while preventing death. The scientific approach to human agony was as methodical as any other Roman engineering project. The psychological torture techniques developed in Roman households were perhaps even more sophisticated than the physical methods. Masters learned to identify what each slave valued most: family members, personal dignity, religious beliefs, and then systematically destroy those attachments. A Christian slave might be forced to blaspheme while being tortured. A mother might watch her children abused until she begged to take their place. The timing of psychological torture was carefully calibrated. Masters would build trust with slaves, showing kindness and mercy, allowing them to hope for better treatment. Then they would reveal that the kindness was fake, that the mercy was temporary, that the hope was deliberately cultivated just to make its destruction more painful. The emotional whiplash was often more devastating than physical torture. Some Roman masters developed elaborate role-play scenarios designed to maximize psychological damage. Slaves would be told their families had been freed, allowed to believe they might see loved ones again, even given fake letters describing their relatives' new lives. Then they would be informed that it was all fiction, that their families were actually dead or suffering similar torture elsewhere. The sexual torture of slaves represents perhaps the darkest aspect of Roman domestic cruelty. Masters had absolute sexual access to their slaves regardless of age, gender, or consent. But beyond simple rape, they developed elaborate scenarios designed to maximize humiliation and psychological damage. Slaves would be forced to participate in degrading acts while family members watched, or compelled to abuse each other while masters provided detailed instructions. Children born from these assaults faced particularly horrific fates. Some were raised as slaves themselves, knowing that their own parent was their rapist and owner. Others were sold immediately, with mothers forced to watch their infants taken away. Still others were killed in front of their mothers as punishment for becoming pregnant without permission. The normalization of this systematic abuse extended throughout Roman society. Children from wealthy families grew up watching slaves tortured and learned to see this as normal entertainment. Young Romans would be given their own slaves to abuse as part of their education in exercising power. Torture skills were passed down through generations like any other family tradition. Roman law evolved to protect masters' rights to abuse slaves while providing no protection for the victims. Legal precedents were established that masters could not be prosecuted for any treatment of their own slaves, no matter how severe. Slaves who killed themselves to escape torture could have their families punished for destroying their master's property. The economic system created incentives for increasingly creative cruelty. Masters who developed new torture techniques could sell the methods to other wealthy Romans. Specialized torture devices were manufactured and marketed like any other luxury goods. The suffering of human beings became a commercial enterprise with supply chains, manufacturing, and customer service. Provincial governors throughout the empire adopted these practices, creating a standardized system of domestic torture that extended across Roman territories. Local variations developed based on regional preferences, but the core principles remained the same. Slaves existed for their masters' entertainment, and that entertainment increasingly focused on elaborate forms of human suffering. The psychological impact on Roman society was profound. Citizens became desensitized to human suffering, viewing torture as normal and even admirable when conducted with sufficient creativity. This desensitization made it easier to justify the broader systems of oppression that kept the empire functioning, from gladiatorial games to military conquest to the systematic exploitation of entire populations. The domestic torture system also served as a training ground for larger-scale atrocities. Techniques developed for household entertainment were scaled up for military use, for suppressing rebellions, for intimidating conquered populations. The intimate cruelty of the villa became the public policy of the empire. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how this system was justified intellectually. Roman philosophers developed elaborate theories about why some humans deserved torture, why suffering was beneficial for certain classes of people, why cruelty was actually a form of justice. They created moral frameworks that made torture seem not just acceptable, but virtuous. These weren't the ravings of madmen or the desperate justifications of guilty consciences. They were sophisticated philosophical arguments developed by Rome's greatest thinkers, taught in schools, debated in public forums, and used to train the next generation of Romans in the proper exercise of absolute power over other human beings. The domestic slavery system created a template for systematic dehumanization that would echo through history. It established precedents for treating certain classes of humans as property, for justifying unlimited cruelty as legitimate authority, for normalizing torture as entertainment. These precedents didn't die with the Roman Empire. They were inherited, adapted, and refined by subsequent civilizations that learned from Rome's example. And the slaves who suffered in Roman households weren't just victims of individual cruelty. They were test subjects in a massive experiment in human degradation, their pain carefully studied and documented, their responses analyzed and cataloged, their deaths recorded as data points in humanity's ongoing education in the possibilities of systematic evil. The Roman villa wasn't just a home. It was a laboratory where the limits of human suffering were explored with scientific precision, where new depths of cruelty were plumbed with intellectual curiosity, where the very concept of human dignity was dissected, examined, and ultimately discarded as an inconvenient obstacle to absolute power. The villa tortures were horrific, but they pale in comparison to what happened when emperors decided that individual cruelty wasn't enough, when personal sadism evolved into imperial policy, when the systematic destruction of human beings became not just entertainment, but statecraft itself. Because some Roman emperors discovered that terror could be weaponized, that suffering could be industrialized, that human beings could be processed like raw materials in a factory of death. Enter Emperor Commodus, who took everything his predecessors had learned about cruelty and turned it into performance art on a scale that defied comprehension. Where previous emperors had been content with private torture chambers and household abuse, Commodus wanted the entire empire to witness his power over life and death. He wanted to transform Rome itself into his personal torture chamber, with himself as the star performer in humanity's greatest horror show. Commodus didn't just participate in gladiatorial games. He redesigned them entirely around his own twisted psychology. Traditional gladiatorial combat followed certain rules, maintained some pretense of sport or honor. Commodus stripped away every pretense and revealed the games for what they really were: systematic human sacrifice disguised as entertainment. But his version was worse because it was personal, intimate, designed to showcase not just Rome's power, but his own individual sadism. He would enter the arena not as an equal combatant, but as a god among mortals. His opponents weren't given real weapons. They were handed wooden swords, blunted spears, stage props that couldn't inflict serious injury. Meanwhile, Commodus fought with razor-sharp steel, protected by the finest armor Roman craftsmanship could produce. It wasn't combat. It was elaborate execution theater. But the real innovation was in the psychological torture he inflicted before the physical killing began. Commodus would force his victims to fight multiple preliminary rounds against each other while he watched from the imperial box, taking notes on their techniques, their fears, their breaking points. By the time they faced him in the arena, he knew exactly how to maximize their terror and despair. He developed signature killing methods for different types of victims. Captured Germanic warriors were forced to watch their comrades dismembered slowly before facing their own deaths. British prisoners were made to crawl on their hands and knees like animals before being speared. African slaves were given shields that were deliberately weakened so they would shatter at the first blow, leaving them defenseless and terrified. The crowd wasn't just watching gladiatorial combat. They were witnessing systematic humiliation designed to break the human spirit before destroying the human body. Commodus understood that killing was easy, but destroying dignity required artistry. He turned murder into performance art, with himself as both director and lead actor in a play about absolute power over human life. His record-keeping was meticulous. Palace scribes documented every arena appearance, every killing method, every victim's final words. These weren't just trophies of conquest. They were research data for perfecting techniques of psychological warfare. Commodus studied the transcripts like a scholar, looking for ways to refine his methods, to make future victims suffer more creatively. The economic machinery built around Commodus's arena performances reveals the industrial scale of his cruelty. Entire supply chains were established to provide him with fresh victims. Military campaigns were planned not for territorial expansion, but for capturing interesting specimens for the emperor's entertainment. Slave markets developed specialized categories for arena stock, with premium prices paid for victims who would provide the most entertaining deaths. Provincial governors understood that career advancement depended on supplying the emperor with novel forms of human suffering. They competed to send the most exotic prisoners, the most unusual torture victims, the most creative execution scenarios. The empire's administrative machinery was repurposed to serve one man's appetite for systematized cruelty. But Commodus's true genius lay in making the entire population complicit in his atrocities. Arena attendance wasn't optional. Citizens were required to witness the emperor's performances, to cheer his creativity, to celebrate his power over life and death. Showing displeasure or horror was interpreted as treason, punishable by joining the victims in the sand. The psychological impact was calculated and deliberate. By forcing Romans to participate in celebrating systematic murder, Commodus was conditioning an entire society to accept that human life had no inherent value, that dignity was a privilege that could be revoked at will, that suffering was entertainment when inflicted by those with sufficient power. Children grew up watching the emperor dismember prisoners and learned that this was what strength looked like. Merchants attended execution spectacles and discussed business deals between murders. Senators applauded torture techniques while planning their own political maneuvers. An entire civilization was being systematically desensitized to human suffering, trained to see cruelty as normal, taught to measure their own worth by their capacity to inflict or witness pain without flinching. The religious ceremonies that Commodus incorporated into his arena performances represent perhaps the most disturbing fusion of spirituality and sadism in human history. He declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules and demanded that his murders be treated as sacred acts. Victims weren't just being killed for entertainment. They were being sacrificed to divine will, with Commodus as the instrument of the gods. Priests were required to bless the weapons before each performance, to declare that the upcoming deaths were holy offerings. Victims were forced to participate in religious rituals before their execution, made to pray to the very gods who were supposedly demanding their deaths. The psychological torture of forcing people to worship the system that was about to destroy them added layers of spiritual degradation to physical murder. The arena itself was redesigned as a temple, with altars placed at strategic locations where blood could be collected and offered to the gods. The sand wasn't just there to absorb gore. It was sacred ground where human sacrifice was performed with religious solemnity. Commodus transformed murder into worship, torture into theology, systematic cruelty into divine mandate. But the emperor's innovations in human suffering extended far beyond the arena. He established what he called correction schools throughout the empire, institutions designed to break the spirits of anyone who showed insufficient enthusiasm for his reign. These weren't prisons or punishment centers. They were laboratories for perfecting techniques of psychological destruction. Citizens who failed to cheer loudly enough at arena events, who showed the wrong facial expressions during executions, who seemed insufficiently grateful for imperial benevolence, could find themselves enrolled in these correction schools. The curriculum was simple. Learn to celebrate human suffering, or become the suffering that others would be forced to celebrate. The teaching methods were systematically sadistic. Students would be forced to torture other students while instructors critiqued their technique. They would practice different forms of cruelty until they could perform them with enthusiasm and skill. They would memorize speeches praising the emperor's wisdom while being subjected to increasing levels of pain, learning to associate loyalty with their own suffering. Graduation required demonstrating mastery of both inflicting and receiving torture with appropriate emotional responses. Students had to prove they could hurt others without hesitation and be hurt themselves without complaint. Only when they had completely surrendered their capacity for human empathy were they considered ready to return to society as productive citizens of Commodus's empire. The family separation policies implemented by Commodus reveal the systematic nature of his psychological warfare. Children were routinely taken from parents who showed insufficient loyalty, not to be killed or enslaved, but to be raised in imperial facilities where they would learn proper attitudes toward authority. These children were taught to see their biological parents as enemies of the state, their natural affections as weaknesses to be overcome. The educational curriculum in these facilities focused on celebrating cruelty as virtue. Children learned mathematics by calculating how many people could be killed with different weapons. They studied history through accounts of successful torture techniques. They practiced rhetoric by delivering speeches praising the emperor's creativity in human destruction. Their moral education consisted of learning to see compassion as weakness and cruelty as strength. Most disturbing of all, these children were required to participate in the torture of their own parents if those parents were arrested for disloyalty. The psychological damage was intentional and permanent. By forcing children to inflict pain on the people who had loved them, Commodus was creating a generation that could never form normal human attachments, that would see betrayal as normal, that would understand loyalty only in terms of shared complicity in systematic cruelty. The economic incentives built into this system created a self-sustaining cycle of horror. Citizens who demonstrated exceptional enthusiasm for the emperor's cruelty were rewarded with wealth, status, and power. Those who showed creativity in developing new torture techniques could earn imperial favor and advancement. The most successful Romans were those who contributed most effectively to the systematic dehumanization of their fellow citizens. Merchants competed to supply the correction schools with innovative torture devices. Architects designed more efficient facilities for mass psychological destruction. Physicians developed techniques for maintaining consciousness during extended suffering. Engineers created mechanisms for precisely calibrating pain. An entire economy developed around the production and refinement of human misery. The legal system was restructured to support this machinery of cruelty. New categories of crime were created that essentially criminalized insufficient enthusiasm for imperial sadism. Judges were trained to identify subtle signs of moral resistance and to prescribe appropriate corrective measures. Lawyers learned to argue cases based not on evidence or justice, but on which outcomes would provide the most entertaining punishments. The documentation systems established during Commodus's reign reveal the bureaucratic efficiency with which systematic cruelty was administered. Every torture session was recorded in detail. Every psychological breaking point was cataloged. Every successful technique was preserved and distributed throughout the empire for replication. These weren't the random records of individual sadists. They were institutional archives designed to preserve and transmit knowledge about human destruction. Future administrators could consult detailed manuals explaining how to break different types of people, how to calibrate suffering for maximum effect, how to design systems that would produce reliable supplies of human misery. The training programs for imperial administrators included coursework in applied cruelty. New governors learned how to identify which populations in their provinces would provide the best victims. Military officers studied techniques for capturing prisoners who would die entertainingly. Tax collectors were taught to identify citizens whose financial desperation could be exploited for recruitment into torture programs. The standardization of cruelty across the empire meant that techniques developed in Rome were systematically implemented throughout Roman territories. Local variations were discouraged in favor of proven methods that had been refined through extensive experimentation on human subjects. The empire wasn't just expanding territorially. It was spreading a standardized system of institutionalized sadism to every corner of the known world. Provincial reports from this period read like status updates from a vast network of human processing facilities. Governors would report on the number of victims processed, the effectiveness of new torture techniques, the psychological impact on local populations, the economic benefits of terror-based administration. Human suffering had become a form of imperial currency, traded and managed like any other valuable commodity. The religious justifications developed to support this system were perhaps more disturbing than the cruelty itself. Imperial theologians created elaborate theories explaining why systematic torture was divinely mandated, why human suffering served cosmic purposes, why cruelty was actually a form of mercy that helped people achieve their proper place in the natural order. These weren't cynical rationalizations designed to fool the masses. They were sophisticated theological systems taught in schools, debated by scholars, and genuinely believed by many Romans, who saw themselves as servants of divine will rather than perpetrators of systematic evil. The intellectual framework that supported Commodus's reign wasn't primitive barbarism. It was advanced civilization that had learned to make cruelty rational, systematic, and morally justified. The social dynamics created by this system reveal how quickly human beings can adapt to unthinkable circumstances when survival depends on compliance. Romans learned to compete in demonstrations of loyalty through cruelty. They developed social hierarchies based on creativity in inflicting suffering. They created art, literature, and philosophy that celebrated systematic dehumanization as the highest expression of civilized values. Children who grew up under this system didn't see it as abnormal or horrific. To them, it was simply how the world worked. Torture was entertainment. Suffering was education. Cruelty was virtue. They had no reference point for understanding that human beings could organize society differently, that power could be exercised without systematic sadism, that civilization could exist without requiring the routine destruction of human dignity. When Commodus was finally assassinated in 192 CE, it wasn't because Romans had developed moral objections to his cruelty. It was because his methods had become so expensive and disruptive that they threatened the empire's economic stability. The opposition wasn't based on compassion for victims, but on practical concerns about imperial administration. The systems he had created didn't disappear with his death. They were institutionalized, refined, and passed down to subsequent emperors who continued to develop new applications for the techniques of systematic human destruction that Commodus had pioneered. The machinery of cruelty had become too useful, too profitable, and too deeply embedded in Roman civilization to be abandoned just because one emperor was dead. The slaves who suffered under Commodus's innovations weren't just victims of individual madness or personal cruelty. They were test subjects in humanity's most comprehensive experiment in systematic dehumanization. Their pain carefully studied and documented, their deaths precisely calibrated to provide maximum educational value for future applications of imperial terror. And the most chilling aspect of Commodus's legacy isn't the scale of suffering he inflicted or the creativity of his cruelty. It's how quickly and completely an entire civilization learned to see systematic torture as normal, necessary, and even admirable when conducted with sufficient organization and intellectual sophistication. The Roman Empire under Commodus proved that human beings could create institutions capable of processing other humans like industrial materials, that entire societies could be conditioned to celebrate cruelty as virtue, that civilization itself could be restructured around the systematic production of human suffering. And once those lessons were learned, once those systems were established, once those precedents were set, they became templates that would echo through history long after Rome itself had fallen, because the real horror of what happened to slaves under Roman emperors wasn't just the suffering they endured. It was the proof that human societies could be engineered to make such suffering seem reasonable, necessary, and even virtuous to those who inflicted it. The slaves who died in Roman torture chambers weren't just casualties of ancient cruelty. They were victims of humanity's ongoing education in the possibilities of systematic evil. But even Commodus's industrial-scale sadism was just preparation for what came next. Because when you normalize torture as entertainment, when you institutionalize cruelty as statecraft, when you create entire bureaucracies dedicated to human suffering, you inevitably arrive at the logical endpoint of absolute power. And that endpoint was Emperor Caracalla, who took everything Rome had learned about systematic cruelty and weaponized it into something that defied every boundary of human decency. Caracalla didn't just want to torture individuals or terrorize populations. He wanted to redefine what it meant to be human by demonstrating that some people could be reduced to nothing more than raw materials for imperial projects. His innovations in slave abuse weren't just about inflicting pain or asserting dominance. They were about proving that human beings could be transformed into anything their masters desired, that the very concept of human nature was just another obstacle to be overcome through sufficient application of systematic cruelty. The construction projects under Caracalla reveal the true scope of his vision for human exploitation. The baths of Caracalla, one of Rome's most celebrated architectural achievements, weren't just built by slave labor. They were built from slave labor. Literally. The emperor discovered that human beings could be processed into building materials just as efficiently as stone or timber, and with considerably more symbolic impact. The foundation stones of the bathhouse weren't quarried from mountains. They were made from the compressed bones of thousands of slaves who had been systematically starved until their skeletons became brittle enough to crush into powder. This bone powder was then mixed with traditional mortar to create a foundation that would literally rest on human remains. Every Roman citizen who bathed in Caracalla's facility was unknowingly standing on the processed bodies of dead slaves. The logistics of this operation required an industrial approach to human destruction that makes modern factory farming look humane by comparison. Slaves selected for bone production were kept in specialized facilities where their diets were carefully controlled to achieve maximum bone density before systematic starvation began. The process took months of careful management to ensure that the skeletal remains would have the proper consistency for construction purposes. Medical professionals were employed to monitor the bone production process, ensuring that slaves remained alive and conscious throughout their systematic reduction to building materials. They developed techniques for maintaining awareness during extreme starvation, for preventing death until the optimal moment, for harvesting skeletons while the victims could still understand what was happening to them. The psychological torture was as carefully orchestrated as the physical destruction. Slaves destined for bone production were forced to watch the construction process, to see their predecessors being ground into powder and mixed into mortar. They understood exactly what their fate would be, but they were kept alive long enough to contemplate their transformation from human beings into construction materials. But Caracalla's true innovation was in creating what he called living architecture. Certain sections of his buildings incorporated slaves who were still alive, embedded into the structure itself as functional components. These weren't hidden chambers or secret passages. They were human beings integrated into the building's design as permanent fixtures. The heating system for the baths included slaves who were sealed into the walls with only their heads exposed, forced to manually operate ventilation mechanisms for the rest of their lives. They became human machinery, breathing components of the building's infrastructure. Visitors could see their faces emerging from the walls, could watch them struggle to perform their functions, could observe their gradual deterioration over months and years of immobility. The water circulation system incorporated slaves who were positioned inside pipes and ducts, forced to manually regulate water flow by opening and closing valves with their bodies. They were fed through tubes and kept alive for years, serving as human plumbing components that could respond to changing demands for water pressure and temperature. The acoustic design of the bathhouse included slaves positioned in resonance chambers throughout the structure, trained to produce specific sounds that would enhance the building's acoustics. They spent their entire lives in darkness, making noise on command, their voices becoming part of the architecture itself. Visitors enjoyed improved sound quality without understanding that they were listening to human beings who had been reduced to audio equipment. The maintenance of this living architecture required a constant supply of replacement parts. As slaves died or became too damaged to function properly, new ones would be installed in their positions. The building consumed human beings like a machine consumes fuel, requiring regular feeding to maintain its operations. Caracalla personally supervised the installation of new human components, treating it as an engineering challenge rather than an act of cruelty. He would test different positioning techniques, experiment with various methods of securing slaves within the building structure, and evaluate the performance of human machinery against traditional mechanical alternatives. The training programs for living architecture were systematically designed to break down human psychology until slaves could function as inanimate objects. They were conditioned to respond to building operations rather than human commands, to see themselves as components rather than people, to measure their worth by their mechanical efficiency rather than any human qualities. The economic efficiency of this system impressed Roman administrators throughout the empire. Using slaves as building components eliminated ongoing maintenance costs while providing superior performance to purely mechanical systems. Human components could adapt to changing conditions, repair themselves to some extent, and operate for years without replacement. Other construction projects began incorporating similar techniques. Roads were built with slaves buried underneath to serve as living foundations that could adapt to shifting ground conditions. Aqueducts included human components who could regulate water flow and perform repairs from inside the system. Bridges incorporated slaves who served as structural supports, their bodies becoming load-bearing elements of the construction. The architectural manuals from this period describe human integration techniques with the same clinical precision used for discussing stone cutting or timber joining. They include detailed specifications for positioning slaves within structures, methods for maintaining human components over extended periods, and guidelines for replacing worn-out biological parts. The religious ceremonies surrounding these construction projects transformed human sacrifice into urban planning. Priests would bless the installation of living architecture, declaring that the slaves were being elevated to serve divine purposes by becoming one with imperial structures. The psychological torture of forcing victims to participate in religious rituals, celebrating their own transformation into building materials, added spiritual degradation to physical destruction. But Caracalla's architectural innovations were just one application of his broader vision for redefining human utility. He established what he called optimization centers throughout the empire, facilities dedicated to discovering new ways that human beings could be processed and repurposed for imperial needs. These centers operated like research and development facilities, with teams of specialists experimenting on slaves to discover their maximum utility potential. They tested how long humans could survive in various conditions, what modifications could be made to improve their performance for specific tasks, and what byproducts could be harvested from human processing. The medical experimentation conducted at these facilities was systematically designed to push the boundaries of what human beings could endure while remaining functional. Slaves were subjected to surgical modifications that would enhance their utility for specific purposes. Some had their limbs altered to improve their efficiency as manual laborers. Others had their sensory organs modified to make them more effective as monitoring equipment. The pharmaceutical research conducted on slaves included testing compounds that could enhance pain tolerance, increase work capacity, or modify psychological responses. The goal wasn't to help slaves, but to discover how their human limitations could be chemically overcome to improve their performance as imperial resources. The breeding programs established at optimization centers were designed to produce slaves with specific characteristics that would enhance their utility for particular applications. Selective breeding techniques were used to create humans with desired physical and psychological traits, treating people like livestock being improved for specific purposes. The psychological research focused on discovering techniques for completely restructuring human consciousness to eliminate resistance, independent thought, and emotional responses that interfered with optimal performance. Slaves were subjected to systematic conditioning designed to replace their human personalities with programmed responses that would make them more efficient tools. The documentation from these facilities reads like technical manuals for processing industrial materials rather than medical records for treating human beings. Slaves were referred to by product codes rather than names, described by their specifications rather than their personal histories, evaluated by their performance metrics rather than their human qualities. The standardization of human processing techniques meant that innovations developed at one optimization center could be quickly implemented throughout the empire. Training programs were established to teach administrators how to identify slaves with potential for specific modifications, how to implement processing procedures, and how to maintain modified humans for maximum utility. The quality control systems ensured that human processing met imperial standards for consistency and efficiency. Slaves who didn't meet performance specifications after modification were recycled through the system until they either achieved acceptable functionality or were processed into materials for other applications. The economic analysis of human optimization showed remarkable returns on investment. The initial costs of processing slaves were quickly recovered through improved performance, extended useful life, and reduced maintenance requirements. Modified humans often outperformed traditional slaves by significant margins while requiring less supervision and generating fewer management problems. The export of optimization techniques to provincial administrators meant that human processing became standardized throughout Roman territories. Local variations were discouraged in favor of proven methods that had been refined through extensive experimentation. The empire wasn't just expanding geographically, it was spreading a standardized system for converting human beings into optimized imperial resources. The training programs for provincial governors included detailed instruction in human optimization techniques. They learned how to identify populations that would provide the best raw materials for processing, how to establish local optimization facilities, and how to integrate modified humans into regional administrative systems. The reporting requirements meant that governors had to document their human processing activities in quarterly reports to Rome. These reports included statistics on processing volumes, efficiency metrics, innovation suggestions, and requests for technical support. Human suffering had become a form of administrative data, tracked and managed like any other imperial resource. The competitive aspects of human optimization created incentives for administrators to develop increasingly creative applications for processed slaves. Governors competed to demonstrate the most innovative uses for modified humans, the most efficient processing techniques, and the highest returns on human resource investments. The social acceptance of human optimization was achieved through systematic propaganda campaigns that portrayed processed slaves as examples of imperial ingenuity rather than victims of systematic cruelty. Citizens learned to admire the efficiency of human processing, to appreciate the innovation involved in converting people into useful materials, and to see optimization as evidence of Roman technological superiority. The educational curriculum in Roman schools included instruction in human optimization theory, teaching children that people were resources to be managed efficiently rather than individuals with inherent rights. Students learned to evaluate human potential in terms of processing opportunities, to identify characteristics that would make people suitable for specific modifications, and to see optimization as a normal part of imperial administration. The philosophical justifications for human optimization were developed by Rome's leading intellectuals, who created sophisticated theoretical frameworks explaining why processing people into useful materials was actually beneficial for both the empire and the slaves themselves. These weren't cynical rationalizations, but genuine intellectual systems that made systematic dehumanization seem rational and even merciful. The legal framework supporting human optimization established precedents that would echo through history long after Rome fell. Laws were created that defined certain classes of humans as resources rather than people, that established processing procedures as legitimate administrative functions, and that protected administrators from any consequences for their human resource management decisions. The international implications of Roman human optimization techniques influenced how other civilizations approached population management. Foreign diplomats observed Roman processing facilities and adapted the techniques for use in their own territories. The systematic conversion of humans into useful materials became a standard tool of imperial administration that spread far beyond Roman borders. The slaves who suffered under Caracalla's optimization programs weren't just victims of individual cruelty or even systematic oppression. They were test subjects in humanity's most comprehensive experiment in redefining what it means to be human. Their bodies and minds systematically restructured to serve purposes that eliminated every trace of their original humanity. The most disturbing aspect of Caracalla's legacy wasn't the scale of suffering he inflicted or the creativity of his processing techniques. It was how quickly an entire civilization learned to see the systematic conversion of humans into materials as evidence of administrative efficiency rather than evidence of moral collapse. The optimization centers proved that human societies could create institutions capable of processing people like any other raw material, that entire populations could be conditioned to see systematic dehumanization as technological progress, that civilization itself could be restructured around the principle that human beings existed primarily as resources to be optimized for imperial utility. And once those systems were established, once those precedents were set, once those techniques were refined and documented and exported throughout the known world, they became templates that would influence human societies for centuries to come. Because the real horror of what happened to slaves under Roman emperors wasn't just the suffering they endured. It was the proof that human civilization could be engineered to make such suffering seem not just acceptable, but admirable, necessary, and even beneficial to those who implemented it. The slaves who died in Roman optimization centers weren't just casualties of ancient cruelty. They were victims of humanity's ongoing education in the possibilities of systematic evil. Their processed remains literally built into the foundations of an empire that would influence Western civilization for millennia to come. The architectural horrors of Caracalla were just the beginning. Because when you've already proven that human beings can be processed into building materials, when you've demonstrated that people can be integrated into structures as living components, the next logical step is to ask, what other applications might there be for systematically modified humans? And that question led to innovations that would make everything we've discussed so far look like amateur hour. Enter the reign of Emperor Elagabalus, who took power in 218 CE at the age of just 14. You might think a teenage emperor would be less creative in his cruelty, more impulsive, less systematic. You'd be wrong. Elagabalus brought something to Roman sadism that his adult predecessors had lacked. The boundless imagination of youth combined with absolute power and no moral constraints whatsoever. Where Caracalla had focused on architectural applications for human processing, Elagabalus became fascinated with biological experimentation. He wanted to discover not just how humans could be broken down and repurposed, but how they could be rebuilt, modified, transformed into entirely new forms of existence that served imperial purposes more efficiently than unmodified people ever could. His palace workshops weren't just torture chambers or execution facilities. They were laboratories where the fundamental nature of human existence was treated as a problem to be solved through applied cruelty. The teenager emperor approached the modification of human beings with the same enthusiasm other adolescents might show for collecting coins or learning musical instruments. The transformation chambers beneath his palace were designed around a principle that Elagabalus called progressive reconstruction. The idea was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. Take a human being and systematically replace their natural characteristics with artificial alternatives that would make them more useful for specific imperial functions. The process began with what the palace physicians called preparatory reduction. Slaves selected for reconstruction would undergo months of systematic conditioning designed to break down their psychological resistance to physical modification. They would be kept in sensory deprivation chambers, fed carefully calibrated diets that weakened their bodies while keeping them conscious, and subjected to escalating forms of pain until they reached a state of complete psychological surrender. But the real innovation was in the surgical techniques developed specifically for conscious modification. Elagabalus insisted that reconstruction subjects remain awake and aware throughout their transformation, not out of sadistic pleasure in their pain, but because unconscious subjects couldn't provide feedback about the effectiveness of different modification procedures. The surgical teams included Rome's most skilled physicians, who had been recruited not to heal people, but to perfect techniques for systematically altering human anatomy while keeping subjects alive and functional. They developed methods for replacing limbs with mechanical alternatives, for modifying sensory organs to enhance specific capabilities, for restructuring internal organs to improve performance characteristics. One of the most documented transformation programs involved creating what Elagabalus called living tools. Slaves would have their hands surgically removed and replaced with specialized implements designed for specific tasks. Some received blade attachments that made them human cutting instruments. Others got hammer modifications that turned them into living construction equipment. Still others were fitted with measuring devices that converted them into human rulers and scales. The precision required for these modifications was extraordinary. The surgical teams had to maintain exact tolerances to ensure that the mechanical components would interface properly with human nervous systems. Too loose, and the tools wouldn't function correctly. Too tight, and the subjects would die from infection or blood loss before their modifications could be tested. The testing procedures for living tools were systematically designed to evaluate performance under various conditions. Modified slaves would be required to demonstrate their capabilities in controlled environments, while palace observers recorded data about efficiency, durability, and user satisfaction. The feedback was used to refine surgical techniques for future modification procedures. But Elagabalus's true obsession was with what he called enhanced sensory systems. He became convinced that human sensory organs were inefficient designs that could be dramatically improved through systematic modification. His workshops developed techniques for surgically altering eyes, ears, noses, and skin to create slaves with superhuman perceptual abilities. The vision enhancement procedures involved removing natural eyes and replacing them with crystal lenses that could be adjusted for different viewing requirements. Some subjects received telescopic vision that allowed them to see great distances. Others got microscopic capabilities for detailed close work. Still others were fitted with multi-spectrum lenses that could detect colors invisible to normal human perception. The hearing modifications were even more elaborate. Natural eardrums were replaced with resonating chambers that could be tuned to specific frequencies. Some slaves were modified to hear sounds too high or low for normal human perception. Others received directional hearing capabilities that allowed them to locate sounds with extraordinary precision. The most advanced modifications included filtering systems that could selectively amplify or suppress different types of audio input. The tactile enhancement procedures focused on modifying skin sensitivity to create slaves who could perform tasks requiring extraordinary precision. Some subjects had their fingertips replaced with sensing devices that could detect minute variations in texture, temperature, or pressure. Others received full-body modifications that turned their entire skin surface into a sensing array capable of detecting environmental changes invisible to normal humans. The documentation from these procedures reads like technical manuals for manufacturing specialized equipment rather than medical records for treating human beings. Subjects were evaluated based on their performance specifications, maintained according to operational requirements, and upgraded or replaced when their capabilities became obsolete. The training programs for enhanced slaves were designed to maximize the utility of their modifications while eliminating any remaining traces of independent human consciousness. They learned to see themselves as precision instruments rather than people, to measure their worth by their operational efficiency rather than any human qualities, to find identity only in their function as imperial tools. The quality control systems ensured that modified slaves met exact specifications for their intended applications. Those who didn't achieve required performance standards were returned to the workshops for additional modification or recycling into components for other enhancement projects. The Emperor's workshops became processing facilities where humans were systematically converted into optimized equipment. But the sensory enhancement program was just one application of Elagabalus's broader vision for human reconstruction. He established specialized workshops throughout the empire dedicated to developing modifications for specific imperial needs. Each facility focused on a particular type of transformation, creating centers of expertise in different aspects of human processing. The Military Applications Workshop developed modifications designed to create superior soldiers and support personnel. They created slaves with enhanced strength through mechanical augmentation, improved endurance through cardiovascular modification, and specialized combat capabilities through weapon integration. These weren't warriors in any traditional sense. They were human war machines engineered for specific battlefield functions. The administrative applications facility focused on creating modified slaves who could serve as living calculators, record-keeping systems, and communication networks. They developed techniques for enhancing memory capacity, improving mathematical processing abilities, and creating human data storage systems that could maintain information more reliably than written records. The Entertainment Applications Workshop specialized in modifications designed to create more effective performers for imperial amusement. They developed techniques for enhancing physical flexibility, improving vocal capabilities, and creating specialized performance characteristics that would provide more satisfying entertainment for imperial audiences. The Domestic Applications Center created modifications designed to improve household efficiency. They produced slaves with enhanced cleaning capabilities, improved cooking abilities, and specialized maintenance skills that made them more effective as household equipment than unmodified servants. The Religious Applications Facility developed modifications intended to create more effective ritual performers and ceremonial objects. They created slaves who could serve as living altars, human incense burners, and animated religious symbols that would enhance the spiritual impact of imperial ceremonies. The coordination between these different workshops required sophisticated project management systems that treated human modification like any other imperial construction program. Specifications were standardized, techniques were shared, and innovations were distributed throughout the network to ensure consistent quality across all facilities. The training programs for workshop personnel included detailed instruction in modification techniques, quality control procedures, and efficiency optimization methods. Technicians learned to evaluate human raw materials for modification potential, to implement processing procedures according to exact specifications, and to maintain modified slaves for maximum operational lifespan. The economic analysis of human modification programs showed remarkable returns on imperial investment. Modified slaves consistently outperformed unmodified alternatives while requiring less supervision and generating fewer management problems. The initial processing costs were quickly recovered through improved productivity and extended useful life. The export of modification techniques to provincial administrators meant that human enhancement became standardized throughout Roman territories. Local workshops were established using proven techniques, and regional variations were discouraged in favor of methods that had been refined through extensive experimentation on human subjects. The documentation requirements meant that all modification procedures were recorded in detail for future reference and improvement. These technical manuals included surgical specifications, performance requirements, maintenance procedures, and troubleshooting guidelines that treated modified humans like any other engineered system. The philosophical framework supporting human modification was developed by imperial scholars who created sophisticated theoretical justifications for systematic human reconstruction. They argued that modification was actually beneficial for slaves, who were being elevated from their natural limitations to serve higher purposes as optimized imperial resources. The legal precedents established during Elagabalus's reign defined modified humans as imperial property rather than people, establishing frameworks that protected administrators from any consequences for their human resource development activities. These laws created categories of existence that fell between human and object, allowing for systematic processing without traditional legal constraints. The social acceptance of human modification was achieved through carefully orchestrated public relations campaigns that portrayed enhanced slaves as examples of Roman ingenuity and technological advancement. Citizens learned to admire the efficiency of modified humans, to appreciate the innovation involved in human enhancement, and to see systematic reconstruction as evidence of imperial superiority. The religious integration of human modification involved developing theological frameworks that portrayed systematic human reconstruction as divinely inspired improvement of flawed natural designs. Imperial priests taught that modification was actually a form of mercy that helped slaves achieve their optimal potential in service to imperial purposes. The international influence of Roman modification techniques extended far beyond imperial borders. Foreign observers studied Roman enhancement procedures and adapted the techniques for use in their own territories. The systematic reconstruction of humans became a standard tool of administrative efficiency that influenced civilizations throughout the known world. The educational implications of human modification programs included teaching Roman children that people were raw materials to be optimized rather than individuals with inherent rights. Students learned to evaluate human potential in terms of modification opportunities, to identify characteristics that would make people suitable for specific enhancements, and to see systematic reconstruction as normal imperial administration. The medical advances developed through human modification research contributed to techniques that would influence surgical practice for centuries. The precision required for conscious modification procedures led to innovations in anesthesia alternatives, infection prevention, and surgical tool design that had applications far beyond human processing. The engineering principles discovered through human enhancement programs influenced Roman approaches to other construction and manufacturing projects. The integration techniques developed for biological modification were applied to mechanical systems, architectural projects, and infrastructure development throughout the empire. The psychological research conducted during modification procedures provided insights into human consciousness that influenced Roman approaches to education, military training, and population management. The techniques developed for restructuring human awareness were applied to broader programs of social conditioning and behavioral modification. But perhaps the most significant innovation of Elagabalus's reign was the development of what he called reproduction optimization. The teenage emperor became fascinated with the possibility of improving human breeding to produce slaves who would be naturally better suited for modification and imperial service. The breeding facilities established under his direction weren't just holding areas for captured slaves or punishment centers for disobedient servants. They were research installations dedicated to discovering how human genetics could be manipulated to produce offspring with desired characteristics for specific imperial applications. The selective breeding programs involved careful analysis of slave populations to identify individuals with traits that would be valuable for particular types of modification or service. These breeding selections were made based on physical characteristics, psychological profiles, intellectual capabilities, and modification potential rather than any consideration of human relationships or individual preferences. The genetic research was conducted through systematic experimentation on slave populations over multiple generations. Different breeding combinations were tested to determine which produced offspring with the most desirable characteristics for imperial purposes. The results were documented in detailed records that treated human reproduction like agricultural breeding programs. The environmental control systems in breeding facilities were designed to optimize conditions for producing slaves with specific traits. Different areas maintained precise temperature, lighting, nutrition, and social conditions calculated to influence fetal development and early childhood formation in desired directions. The psychological conditioning programs for breeding slaves were designed to eliminate emotional attachments that might interfere with optimal reproduction outcomes. Breeding subjects were trained to see reproduction as their primary function rather than a personal experience, to evaluate their offspring based on imperial utility rather than parental affection. The quality control systems for breeding programs included detailed evaluation procedures for assessing newborn slaves according to imperial specifications. Those who met requirements were selected for specialized training programs. Those who didn't were processed through alternative channels that maximized their utility for other imperial purposes. The long-term planning for breeding optimization involved developing multi-generational strategies for gradually improving slave populations through systematic genetic manipulation. These plans projected decades into the future, treating human evolution as an imperial resource management project that could be directed through careful administrative control. The facilities established for breeding optimization became models that were exported throughout the empire, creating a network of human production centers that supplied modified slaves for various imperial applications. The standardization of breeding techniques ensured consistent quality across all facilities while allowing for regional specialization in different types of human production. The training programs for breeding facility administrators included detailed instruction in genetic evaluation, environmental optimization, psychological conditioning, and quality control procedures. These administrators learned to manage human reproduction like any other imperial manufacturing process, with production targets, efficiency metrics, and continuous improvement requirements. The documentation systems for breeding programs created detailed genealogical records that tracked genetic characteristics across multiple generations of slave populations. These records were used to optimize breeding decisions, to predict offspring characteristics, and to maintain quality control across the human production network. The economic analysis of breeding optimization showed that systematic genetic manipulation could produce slaves who were significantly more valuable than randomly captured populations. The improved characteristics of optimized slaves more than compensated for the additional costs of systematic breeding programs. The research applications of breeding optimization provided insights into human genetics that influenced Roman approaches to medicine, agriculture, and animal husbandry. The techniques developed for manipulating human reproduction were applied to other breeding programs throughout the empire. The philosophical implications of breeding optimization challenged traditional Roman concepts of human nature and individual identity. Imperial scholars developed new theoretical frameworks that portrayed systematic genetic manipulation as evidence of Roman mastery over natural limitations rather than violation of human dignity. The slaves who suffered under Elagabalus's reconstruction programs weren't just victims of individual cruelty or systematic oppression. They were test subjects in humanity's most comprehensive experiment in redefining the boundaries of human existence. Their bodies and minds systematically restructured to serve purposes that eliminated every trace of their original nature. The teenage emperor's innovations in human modification created templates for systematic dehumanization that would influence approaches to population management for centuries to come. His techniques proved that human societies could develop institutional capabilities for processing people like manufactured goods, that entire civilizations could be conditioned to see systematic reconstruction as technological advancement rather than moral collapse. The workshops and breeding facilities established during his brief reign continued operating long after Elagabalus himself was assassinated. The systems he created had become too useful, too profitable, and too deeply integrated into imperial administration to be abandoned just because their creator was dead. The machinery of human modification had achieved institutional permanence that would outlast any individual emperor, and the most disturbing aspect of his legacy wasn't the scale of suffering he inflicted, or the creativity of his modification techniques. It was the demonstration that systematic human reconstruction could be implemented by a teenager with no special training or expertise beyond access to unlimited power and willingness to treat people as raw materials for imperial projects. The slaves who died in Elagabalus's workshops weren't just casualties of ancient cruelty. They were proof that human civilization could be engineered to make systematic dehumanization seem not just acceptable, but innovative, progressive, and beneficial to those who implemented it. Their processed remains became the foundation for institutional systems of human modification that would echo through history long after Rome itself had fallen. Because once you prove that humans can be systematically reconstructed to serve imperial purposes, once you demonstrate that people can be bred and modified like livestock, once you establish institutional frameworks for processing human beings like manufactured goods, those precedents become templates that future civilizations will study, adapt, and refine for their own purposes. The real horror of what happened to slaves under Roman emperors wasn't just the suffering they endured. It was the creation of systematic approaches to human processing that proved such suffering could be rationalized, institutionalized, and perpetuated indefinitely by societies that learned to see cruelty as efficiency, torture as innovation, and systematic dehumanization as evidence of civilizational advancement. We've journeyed through the darkest chambers of Roman imperial cruelty, witnessed horrors that defy human comprehension, and seen how absolute power transformed ordinary men into architects of systematic suffering. But as we reach the end of this nightmare tour through ancient Rome's treatment of slaves, we need to confront the most disturbing truth of all. None of this was ancient history to the Romans. This was Tuesday afternoon. This was normal. This was just how the world worked when you had unlimited power and an entire civilization that had learned to celebrate human suffering as entertainment. The slaves who endured these horrors weren't just victims of individual madness or random cruelty. They were casualties in humanity's first large-scale experiment with industrial-level dehumanization. Every torture technique, every modification procedure, every systematic abuse we've discussed was carefully documented, refined, and exported throughout the empire, like any other technological innovation. Think about that for a moment. While your ancestors were struggling to master basic agriculture, the Romans had already perfected the science of breaking human beings. They had standardized procedures for psychological destruction, quality control measures for torture devices, and bureaucratic systems for managing human suffering on a continental scale. The documentation that survives from this era reads like corporate training manuals for processing raw materials. Except the raw materials were people. Actual human beings with names, families, dreams, and fears. Reduced to inventory numbers in ledgers that calculated their value based on how entertainingly they could suffer and die. But here's what should really keep you awake at night. The systems they created didn't disappear when Rome fell. They evolved. The institutional frameworks for systematic dehumanization, the legal precedents for treating certain classes of humans as property, the social conditioning that made cruelty seem normal, all of it was inherited by the civilizations that followed. The medieval period didn't reject Roman innovations in human suffering. It refined them. The Renaissance didn't abandon systematic cruelty. It made it more artistic. The modern era didn't eliminate institutional dehumanization. It industrialized it with technology the Romans could never have imagined. Every time you hear about systematic oppression in any era of history, every time you read about populations being processed like resources, every time you see entire groups of people being treated as less than human, you're witnessing the continued application of techniques that were perfected in Roman torture chambers 2,000 years ago. The philosophical frameworks that Roman intellectuals developed to justify systematic cruelty are still with us, dressed in modern language, but fundamentally unchanged. The legal structures that allowed emperors to treat slaves as property evolved into systems that continue to define some humans as more valuable than others. The social conditioning that made Romans cheer for human suffering in the arena lives on in societies that celebrate violence as entertainment. We like to think we're more civilized than the Romans, more enlightened, more humane. But are we really? Or have we just gotten better at hiding our systematic cruelty behind bureaucracy, technology, and moral justifications that would make Roman philosophers proud? The Romans proved that human societies could be engineered to make any level of suffering seem reasonable, necessary, even virtuous to those who inflicted it. They demonstrated that entire civilizations could be conditioned to see systematic torture as normal entertainment, that people could be trained to celebrate human destruction as evidence of cultural superiority. And once those lessons were learned, once those systems were established, once those precedents were set, they became part of humanity's permanent toolkit for organizing society. Every subsequent civilization had access to Roman innovations in systematic dehumanization. Some rejected them, others embraced them. Many found ways to improve upon them. The slaves who suffered in Roman torture chambers weren't just victims of ancient cruelty. They were unwilling participants in humanity's education about the possibilities of systematic evil. Their pain was carefully studied, their responses documented, their deaths analyzed for lessons that would be applied to future programs of human destruction. The most chilling aspect of Roman slavery isn't the scale of suffering it involved or the creativity of its cruelty. It's the proof it provided that human beings could create institutions capable of processing other humans like industrial materials, that entire societies could learn to see such processing as evidence of administrative efficiency rather than moral collapse. When you understand this history, when you really grasp what the Romans accomplished in their systematic destruction of human dignity, you begin to see the world differently. You start recognizing the echoes of Roman techniques in modern systems. You notice the similarities between ancient justifications for cruelty and contemporary rationalizations for systematic oppression. You realize that the capacity for institutional evil isn't something humanity outgrew. It's something we refined, improved, and adapted for new circumstances. The Romans showed us what was possible when power was unchecked and cruelty was systematized. Every subsequent civilization has had to choose whether to follow their example or forge a different path. Some chose differently. Some built societies based on principles that rejected Roman innovations in human suffering. But many others looked at what Rome had accomplished and asked not whether it was right, but whether it was effective. And effectiveness, as the Romans proved, is a very different standard than morality. The slaves who died in Roman torture chambers left us more than just historical records of ancient suffering. They left us a warning about what human civilization can become when power is absolute, when cruelty is systematized, when the systematic destruction of human dignity becomes just another administrative function. Their screams echo through history not as distant sounds from a barbaric past, but as urgent warnings about possibilities that remain with us. Because the capacity for systematic evil isn't something that died with the Roman Empire. It's something that lives in every human society, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of unchecked power, social conditioning, and moral justification. The real horror of Roman slavery wasn't that it happened in the distant past. It's that it created templates for systematic dehumanization that continue to influence human societies today. The techniques may have evolved, the technology may have improved, the justifications may have become more sophisticated, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Understanding this history isn't just an academic exercise. It's essential preparation for recognizing when those same principles are being applied in our own time, in our own societies, by our own leaders and institutions, because the Romans taught us that systematic cruelty doesn't announce itself with dramatic speeches about evil intentions. It presents itself as efficiency, as necessity, as the unfortunate but unavoidable cost of maintaining order and achieving important goals. The slaves who suffered under Roman emperors deserve to be remembered not just as victims of ancient cruelty, but as warnings about eternal human possibilities. Their pain was real, their deaths were meaningful, and their legacy is a reminder that civilization is not a permanent achievement, but a fragile choice that each generation must make anew. When you close this video and return to your daily life, remember them. Remember what humans are capable of doing to other humans when power is unchecked and cruelty is systematized. Remember that the distance between civilization and systematic barbarism is often much shorter than we like to believe. And remember that the choice between following Roman precedents and forging better paths is one that every society, every generation, and ultimately every individual must make. The Romans showed us what was possible when that choice went wrong. The question that remains is what we'll choose to do with the knowledge they left us. Because here's the final truth that historians don't want you to know. The Roman Empire didn't fall because of barbarian invasions or economic collapse. It fell because it had become so efficient at consuming human beings that it literally ran out of people to process. The systematic destruction of slaves had become so refined, so industrialized, that the empire began cannibalizing itself. By the 4th century CE, the demand for fresh victims had grown beyond what conquest could supply. Entire provinces had been depopulated by slave raids. The breeding programs couldn't keep pace with the consumption rates. The optimization centers were processing humans faster than they could be replaced. Rome had created a machine that required constant feeding, and it was slowly starving itself to death. The barbarian tribes that eventually overran Rome weren't conquering a mighty empire. They were scavenging the remains of a civilization that had systematically destroyed its own human resources. The Goths, Vandals, and Visigoths didn't defeat Roman legions in epic battles. They walked into territories that had been emptied by centuries of systematic human processing. Archaeological evidence from the late imperial period tells a chilling story. Mass graves filled with processed remains. Empty cities that had once housed thriving populations. Agricultural areas abandoned not because of war, but because there was no one left to work them. The Romans had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made systematic cruelty so efficient that it became suicidal. This is why the story of Roman slavery matters today, because we're still living with the consequences of what they discovered. They proved that human societies could be engineered to consume their own populations. that systematic cruelty could be made economically profitable, that entire civilizations could be conditioned to see human destruction as evidence of progress. And they left us detailed instructions on how to do it again. Every modern system of oppression, every contemporary program of systematic dehumanization, every institutional framework that processes humans like resources can trace its techniques back to innovations that were perfected in Roman torture chambers. The methods have evolved, the technology has improved, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. The slaves who suffered under Roman emperors weren't just victims of ancient history. They were the first casualties in humanity's ongoing struggle with the possibility of systematic evil. Their deaths weren't meaningless ancient suffering. They were data points in our species' education about the depths of cruelty that organized societies can achieve. When you turn off this video and go about your day, remember that you now carry knowledge that most people don't have. You understand how systematic cruelty operates, how it justifies itself, how it spreads, and how it ultimately destroys the societies that embrace it. That knowledge comes with responsibility, because the next time you see institutions treating certain groups of people as resources rather than individuals, the next time you witness systematic dehumanization being justified as necessary efficiency, the next time you hear sophisticated arguments explaining why some humans deserve less consideration than others, you'll recognize the echoes of Roman innovation. You'll understand that you're not witnessing something new, but something very old. Something that was perfected 2,000 years ago in the torture chambers beneath imperial palaces, refined in the workshops where humans were converted into building materials, and documented in manuals that treated systematic cruelty as an administrative science. The question that remains is simple. What will you do with that knowledge? Will you use it to recognize and resist when those same techniques are applied in your own time, or will you become another generation that learns to see systematic cruelty as normal, necessary, and even admirable when conducted with sufficient organization and intellectual justification? The slaves of Rome can't answer that question for you. They're beyond pain now, beyond suffering, beyond the systematic cruelty that consumed their lives and their civilizations. But their legacy lives on in the choice that every generation must make between following Roman precedents and forging better paths. That choice is now yours. Use it wisely, because history is watching, and the slaves of Rome are still waiting to see whether their suffering taught us anything worth learning.